Welcome to the Consumer Credit Matters podcast, episode 6. Just a quick introduction in this episode, a reprise appearance from my friend, colleague, and corporate credit expert, Bob Jankowitz. Bob is going to join me today. Turns out we have a lot more to talk about since our last conversation, and we're going to talk a bit more about the intersection between his area of expertise, corporate credit, and mine, consumer credit. Turns out there's a lot to talk about. And Bob is going to share with us and give us the benefit of his decades of experience. And he's going to start with what he believes is the most significant risk to consumer credit, start off with that, and then move into other kind of meta themes throughout the consumer credit universe, including inflation, of course, but it's a take on inflation that you probably haven't heard before because it's based on, again, many cycles of experience, and that certainly has helped inform his view of the current state of affairs with inflation and what is likely to kind of be the outcome in the near to midterm with respect to inflation. We do talk a lot about the auto sector, another area of expertise of his, and use that as kind of exhibit A to discuss how some of these dynamics will manifest themselves on the consumer credit landscape. And finally, Bob ends with, puts a bow on his forward-looking views with respect to a reversion to the mean kind of theory. And I don't want to give too much away here, but it's not a reversion to simply the pre-pandemic mean. This is a much more long-term view, I think it's fair to say, that he has. And in any case, there are a lot of facts, a lot of wisdom being shared in this episode. I do hope you stay tuned and listen to the entire broadcast and enjoy. And as always, thank you very much for joining. Bob Jankowitz, welcome back to the podcast.
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me back again.
Yep. Well, it's funny because, we'll do a proper introduction, but you and I were talking offline since our last episode, I guess a couple months ago. And it turns out there's a lot more to be said. And I guess folks who may not know your background, just to kind of reintroduce you a little bit, you and I spent 10 plus years, at least 10 plus years at Moody's. You were heading up, the corporate credit, a team in the corporate credit business line at Moody's. You covered a very broad array of asset classes within corporate credit, but you and I intersected quite a bit, meaning corporate credit and consumer credit intersect quite a bit. And we shared, both of our teams shared their various kind of expertise throughout that time, because there's a lot to share and get the benefit of in each of our specific lanes. And, that's really kind of the context for what I think this conversation is going to be about, is like understanding the big picture and connecting those dots between what you're seeing happening in corporate credit macro America and how that impacts the consumer credit landscape, right?
Exactly.
Why don't we start with the top risk in your mind to consumer credit?
So thank you for that framing, because most of my comments today are going to be around consumer credit. And I'm going to try to bring everything back into that, maybe using some corporate examples, as you well point out. But I actually think that the biggest risk to consumer credit right now, and I'll get into the second biggest risk in a moment, but the biggest risk is actually the application of AI. And I'm actually pretty optimistic about artificial intelligence. But, artificial intelligence, as you look at this as a technology, I can't think of another technology ever that has risen to the forefront as quickly as artificial intelligence has done. I read a study where it was a survey of C-suite executives, and 61% of them said this is a game changer. But an even higher percentage said they have no confidence in their leadership team to understand what AI really is, how to make it work. In May, Microsoft released a survey they did of 31,000 adults. And of the people who are in that group who characterize themselves as knowledge workers, the overwhelming portion, 75%, said they use AI in their daily work. But of that 75%, less than half used company-provided tools, which goes to some of the complications of taking AI and implementing it within a broader environment. It's very clear, there are many things that artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call it, large language models, generative intelligence, can do better than people. They're better at pattern recognition, they're better at predictive analysis. They're not as good at numbers, by the way, because if you think about the way these models are trained, they're trained on text. They're not trained on numbers. They can write code, but code is very linear. So the implementation in the corporate world, and I think for some of the world that you and I have dealt with in consumer credit, aggregating all these individual notes together is actually going to be somewhat difficult. So you think about what those risks are. I think there's three big buckets. I think one is bias and privacy. These models are trained on history. So whatever implied bias is there is going to continue. There's no test. Because they call it intelligent, it doesn't mean that it can actually see right from wrong. They're just trained on history. And because of the scraping process that takes place, you could be scraping a whole lot of private information, and that gets into databases in ways that were never intended to be the case. The third is inaccurate information. It can be inaccurate because, again, there's no way for these models to know what's right and what's not right. You and I, as kind of know what's right. It doesn't make sense. We used to use this term, the smell tester, but it doesn't make sense. You know, we're knowing about that. And I think because these models are so authoritative. I read about a year ago when ChatGPT first came out that someone said, well, we've all tried it. We've all used ChatGPT. We're all impressed by it. But it comes across like an investment banking associate. Very authoritative, very specific and well put together, and often wrong. And I think that is something that we have to recognize is the case with these models. And therefore, we can misplace our trust in them. And I think the third big point is it starts to deal with reputational risks and compliance risks. You and I both come from an environment, which financial service, which is extraordinarily regulated. Well, how do you do that? And I think the organizers of these large language models, even today, particularly with ChatGPT-4 and the next level, they can't tell you how these models come up with the answers.
Right.
I mean, I remember reading the data that was ChatGPT was trained on, and it was basically a couple of Encyclopedia Britannicas, and Chat 4 was just multitudes of that. So the answers that these models are coming up with can't really be backward tested, and it can result in some misplaced trust. So I think you better be careful about that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. I think that the key is we actually have to embrace it. Don't be a Luddite and just say, you can't deal with it. You've got to do it. It's one of the wonderful, wonderful things. It's going to solve a whole lot of issues for us.
It's funny. I mean, that's a great kind of way of framing some of the issues that AI brings and also some of the promise, I suppose. I've heard, I mean, there's a few things I kind of want to dive into just a little bit. Particularly as it relates to consumer credit. You mentioned kind of the black box nature of AI. You know, these are as the name would suggest, large language models are based on, loosely speaking, the internet, right? And they have millions of parameters. And you're right. I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to know exactly how the algorithm that you're designing is exactly working, making these connections in the large language database in which you're training it. And the training of it and the refinement of the algorithm that you're designing is all about, am I getting an output that makes sense to me when I ask it questions? And that part of it is improving greatly, but the ability to explain what it's doing is still, I think, not where it needs to be, particularly when it comes to consumer credit. Let's face it, if it's basing its information off of people who have access to computers and have a digital life out there and digital behavior that can be recorded, not everybody on the planet Earth, not everybody in the US has such a digital record, or certainly some people's digital records are different than others and are more representative than others. And you can think of this along broad categories of people. If you want to get super sensitive about it when it comes to consumer credit, you can think of it in terms of race or gender, or name your sensitive category. And those are, back to your point about being highly regulated, those are very highly regulated and protected against bias. And you need to be very proactive as a underwriter, as a lender, in terms of your ability to demonstrate with near mathematical certainty that you're not biasing these protected groups in a way, and that's going to be very difficult to do if you don't know what the AI model is doing, in that black box. Again, I look at as kind of early day. At least my optimism tells me that these are early day issues that may be overcome with the passage of time in some way, shape, or form. But nonetheless, I mean, the other thing I'll say is that AI, as in terms of its promise, every industry, every CEO out there has to talk about AI, in their quarterly earnings reports, and how they are adapting or adopting AI. And I would expect there to be, more of a cost than a benefit in these early, months/years. And so some of the dividends that we're likely to see as these models improve are still some way down the road.
That's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair. But when I thought about what's the biggest near-term risk, I don't think it's an existential risk, but I think it's an issue that you got to pay attention to, because it isn't this. Applications of artificial intelligence are not going to go away. And think about what it is that we get for free. Imagine what you get if you pay for it, and imagine what is available at the enterprise level, and then imagine what's available at the government level. It's extraordinary. But yeah, there's a whole lot of risks with it, but I think just pay attention to it. So the second risk, and maybe it is more broadly, and I'm going to spend a bit of time developing this point, that I think inflation, and I have a lot of data to try to support this point, is I think inflation is going to be with us for a while. And I think that we would all be wise to learn how to deal with it. The market today is now trying to figure out how many rate cuts, because that's supposedly an indication about whether the Fed wants to ease and kind of support growth. And I think it's now one. But if we were talking in February, when the market was thinking 6 rate cuts, I would make these exact same points. And it's because that inflation uniquely this time around is a function of labor. And I'm going to get into that. And it's not the lack of jobs, it's the lack of workers. And it's because 2 really critical cohorts of the workforce have left or are leaving the workforce. So when I was going to business school in the 80s, I learned, because the '80s were hyperinflationary, every single decision you had to take into account inflation, whether it was a finance decision, a marketing decision, an operations decision, an HR decision. We were always taught, you got to take it into account. When I was in credit training in my early days in the bank, there was a whole section, impact of inflation. It doesn't happen today. And so to give you a couple of examples, some of my earlier clients, Caterpillar, for example, makes large construction equipment. Their biggest risk was the yen. because the high interest rates in the US made the US dollar very expensive and therefore made their product in the global market very expensive relative to a less good alternative, but still extremely cheap. The farmers, the wonderful farmers, they were told in the 1980s, buy land, borrow dollars, buy land, a hard asset, because that hard asset's going to appreciate. It must, therefore, under inflation. And then you can repay that debt with inflated dollars. That didn't work out very well, by the way. But those are the kinds of behaviors. And I think that there's a whole generation of managers, of analysts, of portfolio people who don't really appreciate how to deal with inflation and the implications of it. Let's put some numbers behind that. So if you look at that price increases just in the last 3 years, just the time we were coming out of the pandemic to today, CPI is up 20%. In the period 10 years before that, CPI was only up 15% in total. Very manageable, imperceptible over a very, very long period of time. And so what is inflation? Inflation is when demand exceeds supply, or the mathematical inverse of that, which is that demand is supply does not meet demand. And I'm going to ask everybody to think more about supply and not demand. And particularly one element of supply is, which is labor. And to summarize the point that I made earlier, it's because, and I'm going to start getting into these points, two really important cohorts have left the market. One is the really important group, I'm going to use ages, but I'm going to describe them in a little bit, 25 to 35-year-olds. They're not in the workforce. And the 62 plus, or really the way the BLS might describe it is 55 plus, who are left the workforce. So what you're being without are the people who need to get the experience, and then the people who have the experience are just gone. And we right today, we're in a really unusual situation where if you look at unemployment, which is a weird statistic because it's only those people who are looking for a job. And I'm going to tell you there's a lot of people who are not looking for a job, so they're not included in unemployment. So here's unemployment, and here's the jobs that are available. So if every single person that's unemployed gets a job, there'd still be a couple of million openings that are available. Now that's improved because a year ago it was like this, meaning for every unemployed person, there were 2 jobs. Some people would say, gosh, that's an improvement. We're getting it to be tighter. That's not. It's not that those jobs were filled with the unemployed. It's that employers took away those postings. Maybe it's because they see the downturn coming, but it's more like I think they can't really find workers to be able to deal with it. So these 2 cohorts that left, to try to describe them, it's one class that I've talked about as the aspiring class, the upward interesting class. Think about this group as overeducated interns, the store manager, the guy who manages the store at one of your local stores, somebody who's training to become a journeyman. These are people who do a lot of work relative to what they get paid. So they don't get paid a lot. They're very productive to their employer. But these people are going to earn over time, but they're in this skill developing. And the reason I brought up my background is because I spent a lot of time learning these skills. So at the ripe old age of 25 or 26, I had to learn to be a banker. And I had to learn skills that I didn't know, and my peers all knew because they had internships when they were 20, and I'm not going to tell you what I was doing when I was 20, but I had to learn all those things. And then it's the older group. These are people who are 62 plus, 55 plus, who are they're very happy. They stopped going back to work post-pandemic for fear, but they had 401ks. They seemed pretty happy. Why go back to work? And when I was working, I hope none of my managers are watching this, but I can tell you that there were lots of days when I didn't do very much.
Right.
But there were some days I did a lot. And I did a lot because I knew a lot. And I was very valuable to the company in times of really, really important areas. And so those people who have the experience are not there to train the people who need the experience. And this
Right.
aspiring group, class, I hate to use that word because it got a lot of negative social content. These are not the entry level people. So what has happened, and economists would say this, is that post-pandemic, as the labor roles were filled, the entry level took those jobs that heretofore were part of the aspiring class. There was a survey that was done by the Chamber of Commerce. It's about a year or so old. And it surveyed the people who lost their jobs in the pandemic. And there were 30 million people who lost their jobs in the pandemic. During the financial crisis, by the way, there were 50 million people who lost their jobs, but 30 million people. So of those, this is 18 months old now, 2/3 are only somewhat active or interested in working. Of those 30 million people, half would not take a job if they couldn't work remotely. And when you and I were working, you showed up to work unless there
Right.
was a blizzard. It wasn't like there was a snowflake. Unless there was a blizzard, you were supposed to show up for work. A quarter got enough government aid so that there was a disincentive to work of the people who lost it. And what's interesting is I want to focus on something that economists use called the participation rate, which I think is a much more accurate reflection about the real workforce. Participation rate is the portion of able-bodied people who are working. It's been going down. But the participation rate today is 62%. In February of 2020, really just before we started.
That's the overall participation rate, right, Bob?
Right.
Sorry, that's not by age cohort, right?
That's overall. I'm going to get into some of these age cohorts in just a moment.
Yeah.
But
Go ahead.
But today it's 62%. Its peak was 20 years ago at 67%. But the real statistic is the participation rate just before we went into the pandemic lockdown was 63.3. So 63.3 to 62.5. You and I come from a world where that's a million people. That's a million people fewer who are working today than were working just 3 years or so ago. And what's really troubling to me is going into some of the demographic questions you brought up is that the participation rate for the prime workers, that is the group between 25 and 54, has been declining. But 14% of the millennial men are not working. That is, 14% of the 25-year-olds are not working. For the baby boomers, and I will tell you that I'm a baby boomer, it's pretty obvious, but when I was 25, it was half that number, 27%. And there were lots of reasons why those 7% were not working. So I get real worried about that point. One more survey that I want to give you a statistic about. The New York Fed did a survey that they released in March of this year. And they surveyed those people who are under 62. And the question was, are you going to work past 62? Right? So of the people under 62, are you going to work past 62? 45% said yes. In March of 20, remember just before the pandemic, the number was 55%. So a far larger proportion of people who are in their prime productive era are planning to leave the workforce early. Same survey. Of those people under the age of 45, in March of this year, 49% said they were going to work past the age of 62. These are the people under 45. I mean, they're planning to get out of the workforce early. 3 years ago, March of 20, that was 56%. So what we're left with is a younger workforce. We're left with a smaller workforce, and I think a less experienced workforce, which has all kinds of social implications like Social Security and Medicare. And to jump ahead, when I listen to the political rhetoric going on today of all the issues, and I'll talk about them a little bit later on, I don't hear anybody addressing the real issue. It's not that we need jobs. It's that we need people to fill those jobs. And one last point before I'll let you move on. Our biggest trading partner, China, does not have this problem, right? China, amongst the most productive group, that is the people who are in their 20s up until 30, China stopped publishing this statistic, but a year ago, when the published statistic was 25%. Now, these are people who have gone through college, who have gone through the extraordinary work to be able to take the entrance exam. They can't find jobs. So we've got a workforce that is leaving, a really important group that are leaving, two really important groups that are leaving, and our biggest economic competitor has the opposite problem. They've got people who really want to work.
Right. And it's funny because I was very aware of the headline around the older age bracket leaving the workforce, particularly during the pandemic. And I guess more recently, I've read that they're starting to come back into the workforce. So maybe the early retirement, high inflationary environment wasn't exactly what they had didn't meet their calculus, let's put it that way. Although still, I believe, is below what it was prior to the pandemic. So that cohort is still lower than it was, hasn't come back. I had not focused at all, frankly, on the younger cohort, though. So that is news that you're right is not getting talked about.
I get so focused on this group of, and I wish I could figure out more catchy term, these upwardly aspirational, these people who do a really good job, who still learning, they're still developing their skills, they're still journeymen, they're still learning, and they will make more money for what it is they do, but not quite yet, who are out of the workforce. I don't know that there's another group that's coming in to replace them. And as I was talking, I was remembering one more statistic about this Chamber of Commerce study of a year and a half ago, and it said 36% of those between the age of 25 and 36 are prioritizing personal growth over work. A third of the people in this really important workforce are meaning travel, training, education. And, myself, and I don't really want to sound like too much of an old guy here, but I worked. My peers worked. And the reason that you worked when you were 25 to 30, you did as many things as you could because you knew you had to make mistakes. You had to get these out of the way. And so the mistakes you made in that age group are quite tolerable. They're less tolerable when you're in your 35 to 45 and making a whole lot more money. It's a very complicated problem, but my real conclusion is going to be related to the rest of my comments here. I don't think inflation is going to go away because the only way that you can deal with bringing prices down is either reduce demand or increase supply. Reducing demand is hard because our economy is a service economy. It's not a manufacturing economy. It's a service economy. So reduce demand means reduce service. Do you want lower service in anything? I don't think so. It's really hard to reduce expectations. There's only so much that one can do through technology. The problem is supply. And the element of supply that can't be dealt with is qualified workers, which are not being put in place.
So anyway, why don't we pivot, Bob? Because I think I want to take this kind of macro theme that you've outlined now and maybe apply it to some of the sectors that you covered, as you mentioned, and maybe we can, bring it into the auto world, which is huge. It's a fairly large contributor to many countries' GDP, but certainly this country's GDP. And it has a lot of these dynamics, inflation, and we can talk about the wage and price inflation as it pertains to the auto sector. Maybe you can take this sector as an example, Exhibit A, if you will, for how this is manifesting itself.
So that's good. Thanks for that. Because let's transition to talk a little bit more about some particular elements of autos. But let me talk about the workforce in the autos. Americans are actually very sympathetic to unions. A Gallup poll earlier this year said 71% of Americans are very sympathetic to unions, particularly among Gen Z, because they just feel like management is unfair. And there's some sense to that because U.S. labor laws are actually employer favorable. And there were some headlines over the last year about the work of the unions. Very, very well-known union standoff with the Hollywood writers that worked out for them. Those who covered the auto industry recall that the Detroit Three had to basically pony up 33% wage increases. It's over a couple of years, but a third increase in wages. And I think you published some data on that right at the outset, talking about how that wage increase translates to how much more you and I are going to have to pay for the car. Even on a monthly basis. Mercedes was faced with a vote. I mean, in the auto industry, there are the traditional unionized plants in the north, and then in the south, the so-called transplants. And the southern states put out a lot of effort to get these great job-producing plants to come into their states. But there has been a unionization effort there. And just in the last, I think, week or so, a Mercedes plant, there was a union vote there that was turned down by the membership. That wasn't the case at a VW plant, though, in Tennessee. This Mercedes plant was in Alabama. And in the case of the Mercedes plant, Mercedes actually did some work which they were permitted to do, tell the workers about what it would be like to be unionized. VW took a different tact, perhaps because they are so concerned about the unions in their home country, and the VW plant in Tennessee did get to be unionized. There's a lot of sentiment. Well, if I'm not going to go back to work, I don't need. Remember my reference to this Chamber of Commerce survey, which is I don't want to go back to work unless I can work remotely. In other words, I get a whole lot of benefits. Maybe I'll get a union to deal with it. But the proof to being in the pudding is that there's really very few workers in the United States that operate under union contracts. Only 7% of the workforce, private workforce, is unionized. And while there's a lot of sentiment, the unions really haven't come back to anywhere near what they had been, principally because I think the workers still think they can do it on their own to do that. So a space to watch, right? Particularly in an area that has been so traditionally unionized, which is the autos. There's still some resistance that are taking place in there. But let's move on and talk a little bit about the auto industry generally. And I specifically want to talk about the auto industry generally, but specifically talk about electrification in the auto industry, which was all the rage 2 years ago. And it's still important, but it's not quite what it was 2 years or so ago. And bring that also back to consumer credit. There was a survey by Cox Automotive, which is a provider to the dealerships, who said that the election results are really going to impact people's purchases of automobiles. So there's a little bit of a delay going on in there, and frankly, any large capital item. But it's really relevant in the U.S. And these are statistics that when I covered the industry on my team, I was stunned by this. The average age of a car in the United States, what do you think? You live in New York, so you don't have this perspective, but just think about it.
Well, I think it's getting to be certainly in the double digits. I'm going to say 12 years. Is it? Am I close?
6 years.
Yeah.
For the passenger cars, it's 14 years. That's the average age in the United States for 14 years. A combination of very high prices and very, very high insurance. But the auto industry is massive for the consumer sector. And it is a leveraged investment for the most part. 80% of the new cars today are financed. So just work through some numbers, and I can take you through the math here. But with the car sales last year in 2023, that required $525 billion of financing at the consumer level to deal with it. So it's a massive issue for them. The average delivered price for a car today, $47,000. The average delivered price for an EV, $60,000. So let's talk a little bit about these EVs. And I think it's important to talk about definitions too. So really simplistically, putting the car market is those cars that are powered by strictly gasoline, internal combustion engines, And the other end of the car spectrum is those cars that are strictly powered by a battery. And then there's those in the middle, which have both battery and
hybrids.
So the electrification has accelerated, but it's still very small. So last year, there were only 16% of the cars sold were electrified. And by that I mean there's got a battery in it. So those that are strictly battery electric and those that are a combination, we call them PHEVs or plug-in hybrids, or those that are the battery powered by energy given off by the brakes. So of that group, 16% of the cars, which is still big, right? That's a couple of million cars. Half of those are battery electric, pure battery electric, and Tesla has half of that market share, just to kind of put these in dimension for you.
Right.
It's growing, but growing at a decelerated pace. And the White House has come off of one of their goals. They had a target a couple of years ago to say by 2032, 2/3 of the vehicles delivered would be electric, meaning a combination of either battery or so right now it's 16%, 2032, which is not that far. That's 7 years.
Right.
That's the life cycle of a typical car model. That would require a 4-fold increase in penetration. That just is not going to happen. They've come off of all that. Big issue is the price of these cars, but the bigger issue is an inconvenience because there aren't enough charging stations. White House also
the infrastructure problem.
Hundreds of thousands of charging stations. That isn't happening. In the U.S., there's 60,000 charging stations. 1/3 of those are in New York and California, mostly in California. And I read a study by McKinsey. They have something called the Mobility Pulse. They just published that a couple of months or so ago. They had some statistics that were just wild to me, and I think even wild to the authors. And one of the statistics that said 46% of the EV owners today more likely to switch back to a gasoline engine. So of those EVs, and I always thought once you decided to become an EV owner, you were an EV owner.
Right.
Nearly half of the people who have EVs are more likely to switch back to a gasoline engine. Some of it is price, it's $60,000 selling price versus $47,000, but it's really the inconvenience. It's not your primary car. You can't just jump in a car and go down to Cape May. You can't do that. We have to do an awful lot of planning to be able to do all that. The positives, and this is something that really I should think about from a consumer standpoint as well, is that the process of buying an electric car, really promoted by Tesla, is really very the way that consumers want. The dealers have spent 100 years figuring out how to get you and me to go into their dealerships where they are in control. But more of the electric cars are purchased online, which the consumers really like.
So this is dealer-less model. At least Tesla's is.
No dealers. Yeah. That's exactly right. And people really like that model of selling it. But still having the dealer network, really important. It's not going to go away.
Yeah.
Has perhaps harmed some sales. Now, it's actually harmed sales more in Europe. One of the things that Tesla did, and I'll get to Tesla in a moment, was when Tesla cut the prices of their cars, and they do this much more frequently than people have realized, that lowered the residual values of the cars, right? When you cut the price of a new car, it affects the residual value, which affects the leasing cars. And not so much leasing in the US, but it's massive in Europe.
Right.
So, because in Europe, a car is usually often given as compensation to the employees. So, and I think something like 44% of the cars that Tesla sold in Europe last year were leased to these leasing companies. It's harmed them. Coincident with that the owners who are the companies, not the people, but the owners are the companies who give them to their employees as compensation, worry about not having a dealership. Where are you going to get these things fixed? And I think the jury is still out about how effective it is to fix these electronic cars. So let me stop there before I'm going to talk a little bit about Tesla in particular. Or maybe I'll talk a little bit about Chinese, because this actually gets into Chinese EVs, because this actually gets into a policy issue.
Yeah.
I think people who follow the auto industry know that in the latter part of last year, Tesla was knocked off its crown as the biggest biggest seller of electric cars. And they've regained that. And I think it's in the last quarter, they just eked out a little bit more. I'm not quite sure how they did that, but relative to BYD. But there are very few Chinese electric cars that are cars anywhere from China who have come into the United States. In fact, I'm not sure any of them come in. But the United States has a 100+% tariffs on cars from China coming in on electric cars. Europe, on the other hand, and I think you know that Europeans are much more receptive to electric vehicles than the U.S. Buyers are. They're smaller. They're talking between 17 and 37%. I think the authorities are leaning toward a 37%, but that could very well be at the high end.
Right.
The tariffs are encouraged in the United States, discouraged in Europe. And in fact, the European governments are actually kind of encouraging Chinese transplants to move in. And there are Chinese companies who are developing cars specifically for the Chinese market. So in the U.S., although this has been a green imperative of the administration, come off of the target, not really put the charging stations in place. And they put up tariffs, and I think you and I remember from our first day in economics class, tariffs are inflationary. And tariffs tend to be met with coincident responses from the country that's at its core there. So very different approach between the U.S. and Europe, and it will affect consumers here. So let me stop there and see if there's anything you want to pick up.
Well, no, I mean, there's a lot to riff on there, and I do want to get to Tesla as well. But I mean, where do you see this going from here? If I'm just, again, you said earlier that you think higher inflation is here to stay. Okay, then vehicles are not getting any cheaper; they're getting more complex and more expensive on any number of dimensions that come with vehicle ownership and maintenance and service and repair rather and replacement. Where is this going? Do you see sales drifting with a 15 million handle on them, over the next several years? Do you see us ever getting back up to the 17 million level that we used to enjoy for, years prior to the pandemic? What are you thinking there?
Well, some context. Your point about 15.3 sounds right. Last year it was 15.5. In context, that's pretty good. I'm not even going to say that's not bad. 15.3, 15.5 is pretty good. 17 is extraordinary.
It was extraordinary for a long time, though, no?
It was. Well,
yeah.
I don't have the statistics at my fingertips, but bear in mind, too, that it was 17, it was upward of north of 15 because we had such a low number during the great financial crisis, which is 12, 13 years ago now. The number went down to like 11, 10, 11. It was still people bought cars. But I don't, at least my mind, 15.5 is a pretty good year. Your point about the financing, and I did say earlier that 80% of the cars are financed. 2 years ago, 90% of the cars were financed, meaning there are fewer cars being financed today because the interest rate that is so high relative to what it was. So if I bought a car 3 years ago, it didn't make any difference to me whether I bought it or leased it because it was basically the same economics. Today, it's a whole different world. I would never lease a car today. You just wouldn't pay the 7 or 8%.
Right.
And then so if I were to give context and say 17 is a really good time, 15.5 is pretty good, 11 is terrible. Let's also remember what that price is. So the delivered price of $47,000 3 years ago, that number was $33,000. I mean, it's a huge difference.
Right.
So people are still paying. They're getting cars. They need it, but they're pushing out. The age of the cars on the road is being pushed out a little bit. So it seems like it's a really good time if you are a parts company as opposed to a car company. So the numbers are massive.
So, your view is that even in a higher rate environment, that 15 A is good and B is sustainable, and we shouldn't expect it to go back up to 17 unless something extraordinary happens, like rates drop down again to close to zero or something like that. And even then, probably the reason rates would go back down to something approaching zero again would probably be for bad reasons, not for, kind of call it the post-great financial reasons that extended for more than a decade.
Yeah. And car companies can spur sales through pricing issues. They can spur sales through subvened financing,
which is happening more now, right? I mean, their incentives are coming back.
There are some incentives, very different than a couple of years or so ago, and they can spur sales by having models. Car companies the traditional car companies diverted a lot of their investment into electric vehicles.
Right.
And I've seen some of these. They're beautiful machines. I mean, if you put an electric car offering right next to a gasoline offering, the metal, just the visuals are so extraordinary. But these aren't selling like they used to sell. And so I think there are companies that are now redeploying the money that they were all in on EV back to their gasoline engines. Toyota's doing that. Mercedes is doing that. Ford is doing that.
Now, yeah. Sorry. That brings us back to the Tesla topic, which you can't get away from if you're talking about pure electric vehicles. And I have to say that there's a couple things that immediately come to mind when I think about Tesla. One is I have yet to meet this is purely anecdotal, but I've yet to meet a person who owns a Tesla who isn't absolutely in love with their vehicle. Okay. Now, I know that there are people who are very unhappy with their Teslas. Of course, there's been millions and millions sold. So you're eventually they're gonna, whatever it is, it's the fit and finish, or the difficulty in getting it repaired or maintained, or finding parts for it once they've been in an accident, or if it's the surprise on the insurance premium costs. All of these things, or the thing that you mentioned, which actually I should have mentioned first, because it's usually the first thing they mention, is like, oh, I didn't realize that the charging infrastructure is a real pain in the neck, right? So that driving, call it range anxiety, really is something that is theoretical until you own an electric vehicle and want to take a trip outside of the range, or you forget that electric vehicle, you're going to be sitting at that charging vehicle, even a fast charge station, you're going to be sitting there for an hour or so in many cases to get enough juice to make it on the next leg of your journey
to the next charging station.
Right, which is you're not used to that. You're used to going into a gas station and pumping up in 5 minutes and then leaving. So these are all things that it seems like if somebody, it seems like that caught up with the enthusiasm around pure electric vehicles about 6 months ago, or maybe a little longer. And so the slowdown was clearer in headline making. And so you saw this pivot in many manufacturers, but that is not the tack that Tesla is going to take. They've seen a couple of things, and I'd like to get your comment on this. They've seen this shift in demand to the hybrids to, again, address the range anxiety issues. They have, as at least a near-term response to that, several times, as you noted, dropped the prices in their vehicles. And they can only do that so much. And then the other thing that they've now talked about with the competition now coming from BYD, is developing a rock bottom, entry level, call it battery electric vehicle that they think can compete with the cheapest BYD cars. And who knows if this can be done, but we're talking about something that would be, at an MSRP of, say $15,000 for a brand new, electric vehicle. A Tesla electric vehicle. So these are the things that they're doing to respond to this, still high demand but waning demand for a pure electric vehicle? Yeah.
Yeah. So Tesla has a lot of fans. So
Right.
no matter what I say here, I'm going to probably get a lot of hate mail. But look, let's just be analytic about it. Tesla has emerged, and I say this emerged just in the last less than a handful of years, as having a place among car companies. You have to
Right.
put it into the mix. It is the company that shook the traditional manufacturers out of their space and forced them, the manufacturers, to reinvest or to redeploy capital into electrification. The battery technology that nobody was ever afraid of Tesla's technology. The car companies that I spoke to were never intimidated by anything that Tesla had. It was just that Tesla had everything in one place and one focus entirely on battery electric. And this really hit me a couple of years ago when I was touring a museum. And battery technology is as old as gasoline technology. And I saw right in front of me in 1906. There was a car that had a gasoline engine and a battery engine. And the placard was talking about the debate, even then, of gasoline versus battery, because it was a whole lot easier to put a battery in then than it was to put a gasoline engine in. But the decision was made to put gasoline because it had range and lots of other reasons. It's not new. How a battery works and the chemistry behind it is not particularly new. The manufacturing is hard, but the technology is not all that hard. Tesla today is like any other car company. They don't want to characterize themselves that way, but they're like any other car company. Let's think about some of the more recent events at Tesla. They laid off 10% of their workforce. They fired everybody who was in charge of their charging station. They cut their prices several times very publicly. They have a product line that is limited and aging. Model 3 doesn't turn heads anymore. It really doesn't. If you wanted a Tesla, you got one. It wasn't the case just a couple of years ago. Now, the company did some wonderful things, and they really came of age during the pandemic, in the exact opposite position relative to the traditional car companies. So the first thing they did was luxury marketing. So Tesla, as you know, doesn't really pay advertising companies. It's all word of mouth, just like you said. Everybody loves it.
Yep.
That's true. Everybody loves their car, I think, because they were told they have to love their car. I think they do, but I think they have to say that they do. There's no advertising out there. Tesla doesn't put its plate on race cars. It's just the way they do it. The Model S, right, this four-door sedan, which really came to market in 2015, but 2018 2016 for real, had a range of 325 miles, but it was a sharp-looking piece of metal. I mean, in my neighborhood, when I saw one, you stopped. You stopped to look at this car, not just because it caught your eye, but you watched it coming along because it really, really looked sharp. And it was a luxury car because of the price. The way Words characterizes cars is by price. So look at who bought these cars. And I had the same experience. I asked everybody I knew who had a Model S, would you like it? And they all said, I really like the car.
Right.
They went on to say, it goes fast. Right. It handles well for a big car. And then there's a pause, and it's electric. Meaning the electric element of it was an add-on. It was a luxury vehicle. The people who bought these Model S were in the market for a 7 Series or an S-Class Mercedes. And I remember a chart several years ago which looked at the market share of S-Class and 7 Series BMW, and they were 50-50. And then a couple of years later, the Model 3 was supposed to be $33,000. I don't think anybody's ever paid less than $50,000 plus for one of those.
Right.
And it was promoted as, this is great. And so Tesla went to the Model S holders and said, would you like to get on our list? And for just $1,000, we'll give you for $1,000, we'll deposit, which are totally refundable. We'll put you on our list. And I said, sure. So before you know it, you had this really big backlog, which Tesla promoted correctly that they did. But the other thing that happened for Tesla, so in addition to having their brand be characterized as a luxury car, and I'm sure you've been in a Model S, you wouldn't characterize the inside of that car as luxury at all. It's minimal, and you may like minimal, but it needed a little bit more creature comforts inside there. During the pandemic, the traditional car companies shut down. They made the conclusion that the consumers are not going to buy cars anymore, so they shut down their factories and they shut down the supply chain. And Tesla put its Model 3 into world-class production levels. And so I don't remember the numbers today, but they're churning out a lot of those cars. But today, to me and to my friends, it doesn't really turn heads on the road anymore because they're so common and because alternatives that come from the other traditional car makers are pretty impressive. And to really annoy people, go put aside a Model 3 relative to Ioniq 5 that Hyundai makes. My gosh, they're just remarkably different companies. Look, and I think your last point about Tesla's response, last I read was that they have abandoned the idea of selling 20 million cars a year. It's a 50% growth rate, so they're just abandoning that, which goes to raise the question of how can you justify the values? 20 million cars makes them bigger than Toyota and GM and somebody else. It's a huge...
Well, which they are, by the way, from a market cap perspective.
Exactly.
Even now.
They're not selling 20 million cars at 20% margins, which they no longer have. How do you justify those valuations? That's my question. And is the company going to redo its Model 3 with a clean sheet of paper? I don't understand that to be the case. It's more like what the traditional car companies have done, which is you modify the frame and you modify the sheet metal a little bit, but you don't come up with a cool new clean sheet. So your thought about a $25,000 car, which is what it costs in China, what a BYD costs in China, just isn't there.
Right.
And I think Tesla is a wonderful company. I mean, you have to be impressed by what it is that they have done. You really do. From their being a game changer in the industry to go from nothing, burning tons and tons of cash, being near bankruptcy in 2019 to where they are today, which I think is a car company you got to take into account when you're talking about the car industry. But I don't think it's going to take over the world like what it might have had. And it seems like the agenda for Tesla is more on self-driving, and a whole different conversation. And
robo-taxis. Right.
And the robot. That seems to be where that company is going. But a perfectly important company, but not as dominant as what you might have thought just a couple of years or so ago. So,
I mean, I think what you're painting is really
realism.
It's a good reminder that you need to have like an arc of time, analytical framework to look at what might seem like, almost singular events in history. And what happened with Tesla is a kind of a classic example of, competition catching up, basically.
It's still a very profitable company. They make money. They sell cars. People like them. It's a great company. But the froth seems to me to be off.
Right. Okay. Well, we could talk about Tesla all day, I think, but they do seem to keep pushing through, and now they have what's the cyber truck, I guess. If you've seen, talk about turning heads, by the way, if you've seen one of those in the wild, maybe that turns your head for different reasons, but it certainly cannot be ignored when you see one coming down the highway or down the street. They're very, very interesting. I think that evokes either a love it or hate it kind of response from most people. I personally think they're pretty cool, but yeah, it definitely gets attention.
Yeah. I had a friend of mine who bought one, and I was playing tennis with him on Sunday, and he showed up with it. And I said, "That's right. I have to go up to Lowe's and buy 20 bags of mulch. Can I borrow your truck?" No, it's a truck that's not going to get used as a truck.
I'll put mulch in it.
Yeah,
but no, he doesn't want to. Right.
Not for what he paid for it. So.
Yeah. That's funny.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, why don't we shift, Bob? I know you want to stick with the kind of the inflation kind of meta theme. Do you have any thoughts on where the economy is going right now? You mentioned at the top that, I think it's one or two. I think the consensus now is 2 cuts before the end of the year. I haven't looked at it in the last few days. If maybe that's changed to 1. But do you still think soft landing? Do you see darker clouds on the near-term horizon with respect to the economy? Because you've kind of painted a picture so far of some things, the momentum moving in the wrong direction. Let's put it that way. Not necessarily. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth around calling a recession or not recession, but it seems like we're on a more negative glide path than what the headlines would have you believe. At least this week.
So even those of us who are market professionals can fall into the trap of being very work from sound bites. Right?
Yeah.
And so many articles I read talk about the number of rate cuts. Well, a rate cut is only one rate. Guidance on the Fed funds rate, which is what really that we're talking about. You hesitated to use the word recession. A couple of years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who's in the business, and I said to him, "Do you think we're in a recession?" He said, "Well, what is a recession?" And it really hit me that that's the right answer, because there is a technical economic definition.
Right.
You know that we can't determine we're in a recession until we've been in a recession for a long time. But it just seems like, I think things are worse off than they have been. And so to put the bow on it, as you say, my life has always been about risk analysis and risk sensitivity. So I'm a little bit more sensitive to the risk side than the other way around. But I think there are some masks, if you will, to a year or two from now feeling worse than I feel today. And I use the word me, not just me, but anybody. And there are masks to that. And things, if you take that mask off, you can do some things to try to insulate yourself from that from occurring. And I think the first big issue is recognizing, don't keep your fingers crossed that inflation is going to go away. I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's going to be here. I don't think we're getting back to the levels that we saw when you and I were just learning how to do things, but it ain't going away. It's not what we had gotten used to. And I don't think there are many people who understand what this means. Just from a financial analysis standpoint, looking at numbers, we were talking about at the beginning, my background, the difference between FIFO and LIFO. Those are not names of your gerbil. And if you know that reference, you're as much a movie fan as I am. It comes from the paper chase, when the lawyers are first learning what that means. There's a huge difference. But a couple things that I think are some of these masks. One is stock market performance. Take a look at our 401k accounts. They look pretty good. The S&P 500 are kind of what's become now our core holding in our portfolio is up better than its historic levels.
Right.
Let's recognize where that all came from. The vast majority came from AI-related stocks.
Mm-hmm.
So the real S&P performance, very low single digits, still very good. But let's bear in mind how the volatility that might go. Home equity. Those 2/3 of the people who own their homes feel pretty good. Right? They made a lot of money because they all look at Zillow and they all see what their neighbors' houses are worth. And they look at theirs and they say, geez, I feel really good. And therefore, I'm going to spend, business class seats instead of getting coach class seats. And I think that's a bit of an illusion because that's just paper that can go away pretty I think working conditions, right? When people today are looking for jobs. They're looking for work from home, flexibility, quality of life, all those things, all making you feel good. When some of us started working, work was work because that's what it was called. It was work. Employers need skills. I'm not sure the skills that the employers need are readily available in the market to be had. Even though workers may feel like it's really easy to find another job, the term quiet quitting seems to have died away, but I understand what that means because you feel like you can get a job pretty easily. That may not be the case going forward. And then goods availability. Just 3 years ago, we were wondering what's on the shelf. We would go into the stores and there wouldn't be anything there. And today it's pretty good. That's within a perceptible period of time that change has taken place. So we all feel really great. But if we factor in the view that I now have that inflation is going to be here for a while and that inflation is driven by not enough qualified workers, which is an enormous policy issue that has to be dealt with, and I don't see any solutions. I'd be real worried about what might be going on, and that is my world might be a little worse in a couple of years than it is right now. Well, sorry, sorry to have that bow. I know you wanted to make it nice, bright red, but
no, that's not the point at all. I wanted to be honest, and I do appreciate that. And I think what you're describing is, in not so many words, in different asset categories or asset price inflation, right? Coupled with, my words, not yours, kind of unrealistic expectations about the the persistence of the current state of affairs with respect to either the job market, the quality of the job market, the quality of the workers, the workforce, and maybe again getting back to price or asset price inflation. I hate to use the word bubble, but what it wouldn't take. It sounds like what you're painting is a scenario which it wouldn't take much for some of these things to correct. When I say correct, I mean, again, another thing that you're taught, in the history of finance is that things tend to revert to the mean, and we're outside of the mean here on a number of these things that are making us feel good.
right.
And so the reversion to the mean, which can happen very rapidly, is going to be very painful and surprising to some people, particularly people who have never been through a rapid reversion to the mean.
Right.
Is that? That's how I'm reading what you're saying.
That's a very good point. Mean reversion is a very easy to understand thing, and we are outside of that boundaries, and we have been for a while in a lot of cases.
Right. The only caveat, and I'll end on this slightly optimistic note, is that maybe this time is different. Maybe. Famous last words. Now we know it won't happen. I mean, there seems to be that, again, we've heard this before, Bob, right? That this time is different. And now you seem to hear that a lot with AI, bringing it back to AI, that's going to be a very, very big game changer. We'll see. Bob, this has been wonderful. Thank you. You've really laid out, I think, very clearly an alternative to some of the, the popular headlines, but kept our feet on the ground the whole way through. And I think, these are good thoughts to bear in mind as you do kind of navigate these choppy waters, and think about what it means for, the next year and the next 5 years, frankly, because some of these things are going to take time to play out, and they're going to be unpredictable, and we're going to have movements up and movements down. But yeah, that reversion to the mean is certainly something to bear in mind here. So thank you.
Well, thank you
great chatting with you.
I appreciate all your questions and the chance to give some thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Bob.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon.